I think a lot of times when it comes to praying with the mysteries of the Rosary, one of the more confounding mysteries has to be the presentation of the Lord. So I want to spend some time today unpacking that particular passage for you today. So quite honestly, one of the reasons why the presentation of the Lord is so difficult, mysterious, is because it's based very much on certain traditions you find grounded in the Old Testament. And two passages from the Old Testament are especially relevant when it comes to this particular mystery. And so first of all, there's Leviticus chapter 12, which talks about purification laws. And so basically, even though it sounds kind of strange, when a Jewish mother at the time of Christ gave birth to a child, she was held to be ritually impure. And so she couldn't partake in temple worship for a certain period of time, 30 days if the child was a boy, and 60 days if the child was a girl. In any case, at the end of this particular period of waiting, a sacrifice would be offered. And so according to Leviticus chapter 12, the offering that was given on behalf of the mother and the child was either a lamb, or if the couple was poor, 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, which was the case for the Holy Family. Now that said, the second passage from the Old Testament, which is especially relevant for us today, is Exodus chapter 13. And so basically the theological underpinning behind this particular passage is that the first fruits of basically anything belong to the Lord. And so for example, the first fruits of one's harvest, the first fruits of one's day, and more to the point, the firstborn son in the context of a family. And so just to kind of bring it back explicitly to the situation at hand, what we find proposed in Exodus 13 is this notion of the redemption of the firstborn son. So the payment of 5 shekels to buy back, if you will, the firstborn son. Anyways, that's the basic structure when it comes to this particular liturgical ceremony that you hear in the context of the presentation of the Lord. But that said, I don't really want to talk about that. I want to focus instead on what happens at the end of the story. And so what you hear at the end of the gospel is that there is this old man, this old righteous man named Simeon, who has been waiting for a long time for the coming of the Messiah. And he says 3 things in a certain sense, which I want to dwell upon and unpack for you today. So first of all, he alludes to the fact that God the Father revealed to him a long time ago that he would not die until he laid eyes on the Savior of the world. And you got to realize that Simeon in this particular situation doesn't just represent himself, but he represents the entirety of the holy people of God, a people who have been waiting and longing and thirsting for the coming of the one true Messiah. And to be honest, it reminds me of this really interesting commentary on the presentation of the Lord by this really famous American priest, Monsignor James Shea. And so basically in the context of his own reflection, Monsignor Shea recalled the words of his own spiritual director, who basically said to him that all sin is unrelated grief. And basically the whole idea here is that grief and all its derivative forms is based on the fact that God in his divine presence and glory is not immediately with us, as a result of which we're in this period of waiting and longing. But you see, the underlying point is that when we respond to this period of waiting and longing by turning in on ourselves, or going the way of grasping, or controlling, or possessing, or having, we fall into sin. We fall into all sorts of sinful and self-destructive habits. Whereas in contrast, what we're called to do is to relate to the Lord even in this period of waiting and longing and thirsting for him, as a result of which these periods, even though they might be painful, become beautiful, they become sweet, because we're continuing to relate to the Lord in the midst of our suffering, in the midst of our struggle, in the midst of our strife. Again, as a result of which this period becomes beautiful in the midst of the difficulty. In any case, the second thing that Simeon says in the context of the presentation of the Lord is that he says that Christ is meant to be a light for the Gentiles, as well as the glory for the people of Israel, which points to the very foundational fact that the church is meant not simply for the gathered, but also meant for the proverbial scattered. And so, for example, even though parish life is meant to be a place where we're called to be restored, to be healed, to be taught, to be instructed, to find peace and joy, at the same time, eventually at the end, we're called to be sent forth, to go forth on mission, to bring the scattered back to church, back to God, back to a sense of being in right relationship with the Father, and thereby be counted themselves amongst the gathered. Now, obviously, when it comes to this idea of living out the church's mission and trying to go forth and bring back those who are scattered amongst the world, there can be a certain intimidation factor which arises in our hearts, because we're all familiar with the statistics regarding church attendance, and perhaps even our immediate experience of people who have fallen away from the church, whether we're talking about our family or our friends. But in response to that, I want to share with you a story that I heard on the lips of Brett Powell. So Brett Powell, as you know, is a really notable Catholic speaker, highly regarded amongst many people in Catholic culture. And once he shared a story about how he himself was once contacted by this local bishop to talk about problems in that bishop's particular diocese. And so basically, as the story goes, the bishop went on to talk about all sorts of, common problems that we find in the church: a lack of vocations, a lack of meaningful participation in parish communities, a decline in church attendance. And at the end, Brett Powell kind of listened. But ultimately, how he responded to the bishop was to pose him a question. And so basically what he asked the bishop was, Bishop, what is the Father saying to you in all of this? And the way he formally kind of closed the story is that the bishop kind of paused and said, well, Brett, it's been really hard. Obviously with a lot of emotion in his voice, with a certain heaviness of heart, which is obviously understandable. But for myself, when I hear that story, what comes to mind is that we must always ask that question. What is the Father saying to us in our particular circumstances? To me, right now, but generally speaking, in this particular day and age. Because, quite honestly, I think a lot of times we kind of forget to ask that question. We're so lost in our own good intentions, our plans, our struggles, our fears and anxieties, that we forget to relate our lives to the Lord, especially in these difficult circumstances. But the whole point is that if you get in the habit of doing precisely this, not just asking the Lord for guidance and solutions, but getting in the habit of relating everything to Him, in good times and in bad, we will find a certain peace in the midst of our struggles, which in turn will help us to develop solutions in terms of how to move forward in the midst of these difficult and challenging times. Okay, one final point, I'll kind of end with this. And so basically Simeon concludes this little speech by saying that the child, the Christ child, will be the cause of the rising and falling of many, before concluding to say that Christ will be very much a sign of contradiction. So obviously it kind of begs the question, what are we to make of this? We'll go back to what we said earlier about Exodus 13, right? So this idea of the redemption of the firstborn son by paying 5 shekels. You'll notice that in the context of the story of the presentation of the Lord, there's no mention of shekels, 5 shekels or otherwise. And the reason why is because Christ is not bought back. He is not redeemed in the context of the presentation of the Lord, which means he is offered by the Holy Family to God the Father to serve his own particular purposes. He is offered as a sacrifice to the Lord. And obviously, as we all know, this particular sacrifice finds its ultimate realization in the cross, from which he hangs very much as a sign of visible contradiction. So what you find in the gospel is that some people are moved to transformation and conversion by the sight of the suffering and crucified Christ, while many people, most people arguably, are not. And so it's very much a realization of Simeon's prophecy that the child will become a sign of contradiction, the cause of the rising and falling of many, something which continues even to this day. And while that sounds tragic, and it certainly is, at the same time, the victory of Christ is assured. Christ has won the war by the wood of the cross, despite the immediate appearance of failure and rejection. And there lies a really important lesson for each one of us. And so all of us obviously are called to a life of discipleship, to become another Christ in this world. And obviously that means sharing in his mission, but also sharing in a particular way in which he brings this mission to fruition. And I guess the thing I want to impress upon you is that what this particular passage is meant to convey to us is that the primacy of our focus shouldn't be on the immediate fruits of our efforts towards evangelization and giving good witness, but instead to become the person that the Father is calling us to be radically obedient to the Father in that particular regard, regardless of how many people respond positively or negatively to our sense of witness. Because the reality is that if you're faithful to being a radical witness to the Christian thing, in a way which is consistent and persistent throughout the course of your life, in the vast majority of cases, you too will be rejected in the same way that Christ himself was rejected in his foundational identity as the suffering Messiah. But the fact remains that despite the absence of this immediate positive response, despite the fact that probably you will never see the true fruits of your labor until the end times, you should feel good about yourself. You should sleep well. You should have peace of heart and trust that one day, a long time in the future, the Lord will welcome you into his heavenly and fatherly embrace, saying to you some variation of, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter now into the joy of your master." And may God bless you all.